Hello and welcome back to the Sleepy Geographer. Tonight we're travelling to a single country, one that seems to break several rules of geography all at once, simply by existing the way it does. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing people from so many different corners of the world joining these peaceful journeys. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. There is a narrow strip of land resting quietly at the top of Europe that, on paper, should not work the way it works. It sits so far north that much of it lies inside the Arctic Circle, and yet its harbours stay open through the winter, while other places at the same latitude freeze solid for months at a time. It has a coastline so folded and so complicated that measuring its true length depends almost entirely on how closely you choose to look. It holds barely 5.5 million people across an area larger than many countries with populations 10 times that size. Most of that land empty, quiet, and folded into valleys that a road may not reach at all. Our journey begins quietly at the edge of the sea, where Norway seems to begin, and somehow never quite end. Picture a map of Norway, the kind you might have seen in a classroom or an atlas, a long, narrow country running down the western edge of Scandinavia like a ribbon someone pinned to the top of Europe and then let hang loose. From above, in a simple drawing, the coastline looks like nothing more than a slightly wavy line, a border between blue and green, no more complicated than the edge of any other country touching the sea. But that simple map hides something almost impossible to truly imagine. If you wanted to walk the actual coastline of Norway, not the smoothed line on a map, but the real edge where stone meets water, tracing every inlet, every narrow finger of sea reaching into the mountains, every small bay and every rocky point, you would need to walk a distance that circles the entire Earth more than twice over. Not because Norway is enormous in the way that a country like Russia or Canada is enormous. Norway, measured directly from its northern tip to its southern edge, could fit inside many countries most people would consider only moderately large. The length comes from something else entirely. It comes from how much that coastline folds back on itself, again and again, at every possible scale, like a piece of fabric crushed into your hand and never fully smoothed back out. This is where geography runs into something closer to a riddle, one that mathematicians have spent real time thinking about, not because it involves large numbers, but because it involves a strange kind of question. How long is a coastline, really? Imagine trying to measure it with a giant ruler, one that's 100 kilometers long. You'd walk that ruler along the general shape of the coast, from headland to headland, skipping over every small inlet and cove too minor to register at that scale. You'd get one number, probably a fairly modest one, a coastline that looks tidy and reasonable on a world map. Now imagine measuring the same coastline with a ruler only 10 kilometers long. Suddenly, you have to follow the coast into bays and around small peninsulas that the longer ruler skipped entirely. Your total distance grows, sometimes by a significant amount, simply because you're now capturing detail that was previously smoothed away. Shrink the ruler again, down to a single kilometer, and the same thing happens once more. Small inlets that seemed insignificant at the larger scale now demand to be walked into and back out of. The total length grows again. Keep shrinking that ruler down to a single meter, then down to the width of your own hand, and the length of the coastline keeps growing every single time, with no clear point where it would ever stop growing if you kept measuring at smaller and smaller scales. Every fjord contains smaller inlets. Every inlet contains smaller coves. Every cove has rocky edges that themselves fold in and out at a scale below what any ruler, however small, could ever fully resolve, right down to the individual grains of stone and sand that make up the shoreline itself. This strange property, where a coastline's measured length keeps increasing the more closely you look at it, has a name among mathematicians. They call it the coastline paradox, and it was first properly explored by a mathematician studying the border of Britain, who noticed that different national surveys of the very same coastline reported wildly different total lengths, simply because each country's mapmakers had chosen to measure at a different scale. Norway happens to be one of the most extreme examples of this paradox found anywhere on the surface of the Earth, because of just how deeply, how repeatedly, its shoreline folds in on itself at every single scale you care to examine. Most coastlines in the world are drawn by the ordinary, patient work of waves and tides, slowly wearing down whatever rock happens to sit at the boundary between land and sea, rounding out sharp points, filling in soft hollows, smoothing everything toward a gentler, simpler curve over time. But Norway's coast was not shaped primarily by waves at all. It was shaped by something with far more patience and far more force, something that carved its way through solid rock long before the sea ever arrived to soften the edges. We'll return to that force in a moment, because it's the real reason this coastline behaves the way it does. But first, it's worth sitting with the coastline itself a little longer, because the shape it makes is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. Now imagine gliding slowly along Norway's western coast on a clear day, following the coast from south to north. Beneath you, the shoreline never settles into anything resembling a straight line for more than a few moments at a time. It bends inward, forming a long, narrow channel of water reaching deep into the mountains, sometimes for well over 100 kilometers, the water so enclosed by steep rock walls on either side that from above it looks less like open sea and more like a river that happens to be filled with the ocean instead of fresh water. Then the shoreline bends outward again, wrapping around a headland before curving back inward into another long inlet entirely separate from the one before it, each one carrying its own quiet villages, its own fishing boats, its own particular slant of afternoon light depending on which direction its steep walls happen to face. These deep, narrow inlets are called fjords, and Norway has thousands of them, ranging from world-famous ones that draw visitors from every part of the globe to small, nameless ones that a single fishing family might be the only people to ever really know, tucked so far back into the mountains that a boat is often still the only practical way to reach the small cluster of houses resting at the water's edge. Standing at the head of one of these fjords, at the point furthest from the open sea, brings a quiet feeling that's difficult to find replicated anywhere else. The water beneath you is genuinely ocean water, salty, tidal, connected all the way out to the Atlantic. And yet you are surrounded on every side, sometimes for the entire visible horizon, by mountains rising directly out of that water, their slopes so steep in places that trees struggle to hold on to the thin soil clinging to the rock, their peaks often capped with snow even in the warmer months, their reflections lying so still and so complete on windless days that the fjord seems to hold two identical mountain ranges at once, one reaching up into the sky and one reaching down into the water, meeting at a single, perfectly flat line where the stone gives way to its own mirror image. The water inside a fjord behaves differently from the open sea beyond it, sheltered as it is by the surrounding walls of rock. Waves rarely build to any real size this far inland, protected as the water is on every side. Wind still moves across the surface, sometimes funneling down through the narrow channel with unusual force, gathering speed the way air always gathers speed when squeezed through a narrower space. But the water itself tends toward calm, especially in the early morning hours before that wind has had the chance to properly wake. Beneath the surface, a fjord often carries a hidden structure that most visitors never think to consider. Near the mouth of many fjords, where the glacier that carved them once slowed and paused before finally retreating for good. A raised ridge of rock and debris crosses the seafloor, called a sill, sitting sometimes just a few dozen meters below the surface, even where the fjord behind it plunges down for hundreds of meters more. This sill acts almost like a low wall, restricting how easily deep water can exchange with the open ocean beyond, and in some of the more enclosed fjords, it means the deepest water resting at the very bottom of the fjord can remain nearly unmoving for years at a time, cold and still and cut off from the currents that keep the surface water above it circulating freely. And running alongside nearly every fjord, following the same long, narrow shape carved by the exact same forces, are the roads and rail lines that allow people to actually live and move through this landscape. Norwegian engineers have spent well over a century finding ways to travel through and around a landscape that resists straight lines almost entirely, carving tunnels directly through solid mountains rather than attempting to climb over them, building bridges across narrow points in fjords rather than driving all the way around, occasionally routing roads through spiral tunnels that curl downward inside. The mountain itself, like the inside of a shell, dropping a vehicle down through solid rock in a slow, continuous turn until it finally emerges, sometimes hundreds of meters lower, at the edge of the very fjord the road had originally set out to cross. There is something worth noticing in how much effort an entire nation has put into simply moving through the shape of its own coastline. Nowhere else, or almost nowhere else, does geography demand quite this much of the people trying to live within it, and yet the people who have lived here for generations rarely describe it as difficult in the way an outsider might expect. It's simply the shape of home. The fjord outside the window has always been there, curling inland the way it always has, and the mountains on either side of it have always stood exactly where they stand now, patient and unmoving in a landscape defined almost entirely by water finding its way into stone. But none of these fjords, however dramatic they appear today, were originally carved by the sea at all. To understand where a fjord actually comes from, we have to go back to a period long before the ocean ever crept into these valleys, a period when there was no water here at all, only ice. An amount of ice difficult to properly picture, stacked so high and so heavy that it pressed down on the land beneath it with a weight capable of physically bending solid rock. Now let your thoughts wander back to Norway some 20,000 years ago, near the peak of the last ice age. Almost the entire landscape we've just been describing, every mountain, every valley, every place a fjord exists today, lay buried beneath a single continuous sheet of ice, in places well over 2 kilometers thick. Not the kind of ice found on a frozen lake, thin and brittle. A vast, continuous mass, so deep that its own base, pressed under the weight of everything above it, existed under enough pressure to behave less like solid ice and more like something capable of slow, continuous movement, flowing outward from the highest points of accumulation toward the edges of the ice sheet, the way water flows outward from the center of a very slowly filling bowl. This moving ice did not simply rest on top of the landscape beneath it. It carried with it, frozen into its own base, an enormous quantity of rock and grit, torn loose from the mountains the ice had already passed over, and it dragged that rock and grit across the land beneath it, the way sandpaper is dragged across wood, grinding, scouring, cutting downward into valleys that had originally been shaped by ordinary rivers long before the ice ever arrived. A river cuts a valley into a shape resembling the letter V, its water concentrated at the very bottom, cutting deepest there, while the upper slopes are left to erode more gently over time by rain and frost. A glacier does something entirely different. It fills the entire width of a valley from wall to wall, and as it moves, it erodes the floor and the sides with equal, relentless persistence, widening the valley as much as it deepens it, carving it instead into a much broader shape, generally described as resembling the letter U, its walls steep and often nearly vertical, its floor wide and smoothed into long, gentle curves. This is precisely the shape of a fjord today, though today it holds seawater instead of ice. Every fjord in Norway began its life as one of these glacially carved valleys, ground into the shape it now holds by ice that had nowhere else to go but downhill, following the same paths that water had already begun carving long before any ice sheet ever formed, deepening and widening those original valleys until some of them were carved to a depth well below what would eventually become sea level. Once the ice finally retreated, the rock these glaciers were cutting into was not ordinary rock, either, at least not by the standards of most landscapes on Earth. Beneath much of Norway lies some of the oldest bedrock found anywhere on the planet's surface, Precambrian stone, formed and hardened well over 1 billion years before the ice ages that eventually carved it into fjords. Stone that had already been sitting quietly beneath whatever landscape existed above it for a length of time that makes even the ice ages themselves seem almost recent by comparison. This ancient stone tends to be extremely hard, extremely resistant, exactly the kind of foundation capable of holding a steep, near-vertical fjord wall standing upright for thousands of years after the ice that carved it has long since melted away, rather than slowly crumbling or slumping the way softer, younger rock might under the same conditions. Some of this bedrock, exposed today along certain fjord walls and mountain faces, carries within it a record of an even older landscape entirely, bands and swirls of different mineral colours frozen into the stone from a time when this same rock sat far beneath the surface, folded and reshaped by heat and pressure long before it was ever lifted, worn down, buried by ice, and finally exposed again to open air. Geologists who study these formations describe reading them almost like pages, each band of colour and texture marking some ancient event, a mountain-building collision, a long period of quiet burial, a slow uplift toward the light that occurred so far back in the planet's history that the rock itself has outlasted nearly everything else this world has produced since. Imagine the ice at the height of the last ice age, filling one of these ancient valleys completely, its surface far above where any fjord's waterline sits today, grinding slowly downward and outward, carrying rock fragments the size of houses within its own frozen body, polishing the exposed bedrock beneath it smooth in places, gouging deep parallel scratches into it in others, wherever a particularly stubborn boulder happened to be dragged along the base of the ice for kilometers at a time. Some of those same scratches, cut into solid stone by rock trapped inside moving ice, remain visible today on certain fjord walls, faint parallel lines running in the exact direction the ice was travelling, a signature left behind by a process that finished its work so long ago that entire ecosystems have had time to establish themselves in the valley since, and yet the marks in the stone itself have barely faded at all, protected by the same hardness that made this rock so resistant to the ice in the first place. As the Ice Age eventually began to end, gradually, unevenly, over thousands of years rather than in any single dramatic thaw, the great ice sheet covering Norway slowly began retreating, its edges melting back further each summer than they were able to regrow each winter, the whole enormous mass shrinking by degrees too slow to observe directly but unmistakable when compared across centuries. As the ice melted, it released the tremendous weight it had been pressing down onto the land beneath it for tens of thousands of years, weight substantial enough that the land itself had been physically compressed downward under the pressure, the way a mattress compresses under the weight of someone lying on it. Freed from that pressure, the land began to rise back upward, a slow rebound that in certain parts of Scandinavia continues even today, thousands of years after the ice that originally caused the compression has completely disappeared, the ground still gradually lifting itself back toward whatever height it would naturally hold without the ancient burden of all that ice pressing down on it. In some coastal areas, this ongoing rise can still be measured. Land quietly emerging from the sea a few millimeters each year. Old harbours that once sat directly at the waterline, now found sitting a short, dry walk inland. The shoreline slowly abandoning them the way a tide abandons a beach, only far too slowly for anyone alive to notice it happening in real time. At the same time that the land was slowly rising, the ice that had been melting away was releasing an enormous quantity of water back into the world's oceans. Water that had been locked away as solid ice for the entire duration of the Ice Age, now returning to the sea and causing global sea levels to rise substantially as a result. These two forces, land slowly rising, sea slowly rising, did not move at exactly the same pace everywhere, and in the newly carved valleys of Norway, once occupied by glaciers and now standing empty and exposed for the first time in tens of thousands of years, the balance between them meant that seawater found its way in, flooding valleys that had been cut by ice down to depths well below the new sea level, filling them from the outer coast inward, following the same paths the glaciers themselves had once carved, all the way back to the steep-walled valley heads deep in the mountains. This is the final quiet step in how a fjord comes to exist. A river valley, ancient beyond easy comprehension, cut first by moving water long before any ice age began, then buried and reshaped entirely by ice, ground down and widened into the deep, steep-walled trench that would define its final shape. And then, once the ice finally retreated, flooded by the returning sea, filling a valley that had spent the Ice Age holding nothing but frozen weight, replacing that ice with water instead, and leaving behind exactly the landscape we still find today, standing quietly under an open sky, its walls holding the memory of ice in stone hard enough to remember it for as long as anyone might care to look. Stand at the edge of one of these fjords today, and everything about it, the depth of the water beneath your feet, the steepness of the walls rising on either side, the particular U-shaped curve of the valley continuing on ahead of you toward the sea, is a direct, physical record of that entire process, written into the landscape itself rather than into any book or any measurement. The fjord does not know its own history in any sense a person would recognize. It simply holds the shape that history left behind, the same way every landscape we've explored on this channel holds the shape of whatever slow force built it, patient and permanent, indifferent to whether anyone standing beside it today understands exactly how it came to look the way it does. And that ancient, endlessly folding coastline we spent the beginning of this journey trying to measure, the one that grows longer every time you look more closely at it, exists precisely because of this process, repeated again and again along the entire length of Norway's western edge. Thousands of separate fjords, each one its own individual glacial valley, each one flooded by the sea in its own particular way, together create a coastline so deeply and repeatedly folded that no single measurement of it could ever really be called final. The mathematics of the coastline paradox and the deep history of glacial carving turn out to be describing the very same landscape, one from the perspective of abstract geometry, and the other from the perspective of ice that finished its work a very long time ago and left this entire folded, flooded shape behind as the only evidence it was ever here at all. We'll leave the fjords resting peacefully here for now, their still water holding the reflection of whatever sky happens to be stretched above them tonight, and we'll turn next to something that seems, at first glance, to contradict almost everything we've just described. A country reaching so far into the Arctic that parts of it experience genuine polar conditions, and yet holding harbours along its coast that never freeze at all, warmed by a very particular and very unlikely current moving quietly beneath the surface of the sea. That quiet current beneath the sea changes far more than most people ever realise. There is a particular kind of confusion that settles over anyone looking at Norway on a globe for the first time, especially if they've spent any time thinking about how climate is supposed to work. The far north of Norway sits above the Arctic Circle, at a latitude shared with parts of Siberia and northern Canada, places where winter typically means temperatures dropping to depths that make ordinary outdoor life genuinely dangerous. Harbours frozen solid enough to walk across, entire settlements cut off from the sea for months because no ship can break through the ice thick enough to reach them. By every reasonable expectation, a Norwegian port sitting at that same latitude should behave exactly the same way. And yet it doesn't. The port of Tromsø, well north of the Arctic Circle, remains open and navigable through the entire winter, ships arriving and departing on an ordinary schedule, while those northern latitudes on the other side of the globe, the sea has been locked in ice for months. Even Narvik, further north still, keeps its harbour working through the darkest and coldest part of the year, its docks busy loading and unloading cargo under skies that, at that time of year, barely produce daylight worth mentioning at all. This isn't a small anomaly. It's one of the more striking climate mismatches found anywhere on the planet. A coastline that should, by every rule governing latitude and temperature, be locked in ice for a significant part of the year, behaving instead as though it belonged to a much milder, much gentler part of the world. The explanation for this lies not in Norway itself, but far to the south and west, in the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico and the wider tropical Atlantic, where the sun heats the surface of the ocean far more intensely than it ever manages at higher latitudes. That warm water doesn't simply stay where it's heated. Ocean currents, driven by a combination of wind, the Earth's own rotation, and differences in water density between warmer and cooler regions, move enormous volumes of that heated water steadily northward, tracing a long, curving path up the eastern coast of North America before crossing the entire width of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the Gulf Stream, one of the most powerful and most closely studied ocean currents on Earth, carrying warm surface water northward at a volume and a pace that dwarfs the combined flow of every river on the planet, all moving together as a single continuous stream through open, otherwise undifferentiated sea. By the time this warm water crosses the Atlantic and approaches the coast of northern Europe, it has cooled somewhat from its tropical origins, but it retains a significant amount of the heat it originally absorbed near the equator. And this continuation of the current, once it moves into the waters near Europe, takes on a slightly different name among oceanographers, the North Atlantic Drift, THOF. It's really the same continuous body of warm water, simply renamed as it enters a new stretch of ocean on its long journey north. This drift of warm water moves directly along the coast of Norway, following the same general path as the coastline itself, carrying with it heat gathered thousands of kilometers away near the equator and releasing that heat slowly into the air above the quiet sea as it travels. Air passing over warm water absorbs some of that warmth and moisture, and as the prevailing westerly winds carry that warmed, moistened air onward across the Norwegian coast, they deliver a mildness to the climate that has no business existing this far north, tempering winters that should, by every measure of latitude alone, be locked in the same deep, unyielding cold found at the same latitude almost anywhere else in the world. Picture the actual physical difference this makes, standing on a dock in a small Norwegian fishing town well above the Arctic Circle in the middle of winter. The air is cold, certainly, cold enough to see your own breath, cold enough to need real winter clothing to stay comfortable for any length of time outdoors. But it isn't the kind of cold that stops the world entirely, the kind that shuts down machinery, freezes fuel lines, forces an entire settlement into a kind of prolonged indoor hibernation for months at a stretch. Boats still leave the quiet harbour. Fish are still caught, sorted, and shipped onward. Roads, while sometimes snow-covered, remain generally passable, cleared and salted through a system built around the expectation that life, in some meaningful form, continues through the winter rather than simply pausing until spring returns. Compare that to a settlement at that far north on the other side of the world, deep in Siberia, far from any warming ocean current, where winter temperatures regularly plunge to levels capable of freezing exposed skin within minutes, where entire rivers freeze solid enough to drive trucks across, where daily life genuinely does reorganize itself entirely around the brutal reality of a cold with no oceanic current nearby offering any kind of relief. The very same part of the world. The tilt of the Earth relative to the Sun is the same. The number of daylight hours in winter is nearly identical. And yet the two places might as well belong to entirely different climate zones, separated not by geography in the usual sense, but by the presence or absence of a single, enormous, invisible river of warm water moving quietly along one coastline and never reaching the other at all. This warming effect isn't limited to keeping harbours ice-free, either. It shapes the entire character of life along Norway's coast in ways that ripple outward from that one basic fact. Fishing grounds along the Norwegian coast, warmed by this same current, support far richer and more productive marine ecosystems than would otherwise exist this far north. Cod and other cold water species thriving in waters kept just warm enough, just consistently enough, to sustain large populations across generations, forming the basis of a fishing industry that has shaped Norwegian coastal life. And Norwegian coastal towns for as long as people have lived along this shore at all. Even the vegetation along parts of the coast reflects this unusual mildness. In certain sheltered pockets along the southwestern coast, warmed consistently enough by the nearby current, and protected from the harshest winds by the surrounding mountains, gardens have been known to support plants that have no business surviving this far north by any conventional understanding of plant hardiness, palm trees among them, standing somewhat improbably against a backdrop of fjords and snow-capped peaks, a small, deliberate testament to just how much warmth this ocean current manages to carry into a landscape that would otherwise reject it entirely. There is something worth sitting with in the sheer scale of what's actually happening here, largely out of sight, beneath the surface of the sea. An ocean current, warmed near the equator by sunlight falling on tropical water, travels for thousands of kilometers, entirely without any pump or engine driving it forward, powered only by wind, rotation, and the patient physics of temperature and density. And by the time it reaches the coast of a country perched at the very edge of the Arctic, it still carries enough of that original warmth to keep. An entire coastline's harbours open through months of darkness that would otherwise freeze them solid. None of this warmth is visible in any direct way. You cannot look at the sea along the Norwegian coast and see the current moving past, cannot watch it the way you might watch a river's surface reveal its own motion. It exists instead as an invisible, ongoing influence, felt only in its consequences, in the mildness of a winter that should be harsher, in a harbour that should be frozen and isn't, in gardens holding plants that should have no reasonable chance of surviving this far north, and yet do, year after year, quietly benefiting from a warmth carried to them across an entire ocean by a current most of the people, enjoying its effects, will never think about at all. Scientists who study this current closely have noted that its strength and position are not entirely fixed, either, shifting slightly from year to year and over longer stretches of time, subject to changes that ripple outward into the climate of the entire North Atlantic region. Even a small shift in how much warm water this current delivers to Norway's coast can be felt in the timing of a fishing season, in how far north certain marine species choose to range that year, in whether a particular winter along the coast feels a little milder or a little harsher than the one before it, a quiet reminder that even a warmth this dependable is still, at its heart, part of a larger and constantly shifting system. Rather than some fixed and permanent gift, the ocean simply hands to this coastline every year without variation. This same warmth, carried steadily northward along the coast, also plays a quiet role in something we'll return to later in this journey: the particular quality of light and darkness found in this part of the world, because a climate mild enough to remain livable through an Arctic winter is also, necessarily, a climate where people have had the practical ability to actually settle and remain generation after generation in places that a harsher climate would have made essentially uninhabitable, regardless of how spectacular the surrounding fjords and mountains might otherwise have been. And that brings us, gently, to a very different kind of geography entirely, one concerned not with temperature or current, but with something more human. The question of where people actually live in this country, and just as tellingly, where they don't. Norway holds a population of roughly 5.5 million people, a modest number by global standards, smaller than many individual cities found elsewhere in the world. And yet the land those 5.5 million people are spread across is vast, stretching from the gentler farmland and forest of the south all the way up through mountain ranges, fjords, and Arctic tundra to a northern tip well inside the polar region. Divide that population evenly across that land, and you'd expect a fairly sparse but reasonably consistent pattern of settlement, small towns and villages spread out at roughly similar distances from one another across the entire country. But Norway's population doesn't spread out evenly at all. It clusters tightly in certain regions, particularly around the southern coast and the area surrounding Oslo, while enormous stretches of the interior and the north remain almost entirely empty, some valleys holding no permanent settlement of any kind, some stretches of coastline supporting nothing more than a single small fishing village separated from its nearest neighbour by a genuinely significant distance of open water or impassable mountain. This pattern exists because Norway's geography has never been particularly generous toward large-scale settlement. The same mountains that create such dramatic fjords also make most of the country's interior extremely difficult to farm, steep and rocky, holding thin soil unable to support the kind of large-scale agriculture that allowed dense populations to grow in flatter, gentler parts of the world. Only a relatively small percentage of Norway's total land area is suitable for farming at all, most of it concentrated in the flatter regions around Oslo and in scattered pockets elsewhere. And this scarcity of farmable land has shaped where people have been able to settle for as long as anyone has lived in this landscape. Picture a map of Norway with population density marked across it, using colour to show where people actually live. The southern coast, and especially the region around Oslo, glows with a fairly dense, continuous colour, towns and cities sitting close enough together that the gaps between them feel more like countryside than true wilderness. But follow that same map northward and inland, and the colour begins to fade almost immediately, thinning into isolated points of settlement separated by vast stretches, showing no meaningful population at all, mountain valleys, high plateaus, and long stretches of fjord-lined coast where the only sign of human presence might be a single small cluster of buildings, a single dock, a single narrow road, winding along the water's edge before disappearing again into the mountains. This isn't a modern phenomenon born of people choosing to move to cities for economic reasons, the way rural populations have thinned in many parts of the world over the past century. Norway's population has always clustered this way, shaped from the very beginning by a landscape that simply couldn't support large, densely settled communities spread evenly across its full expanse. Even centuries ago, before any modern city existed in the form we'd recognize today, the same basic pattern held true. People settling where farmland, fishing grounds, and sheltered harbours made survival practical, and largely avoiding the vast stretches of mountain and high plateau where none of those advantages existed. Many of the smaller, more isolated settlements that do exist along this coastline and throughout these valleys developed a particular kind of self-sufficiency as a direct consequence of their isolation. Communities that, for long stretches of their history, had only limited and occasional contact with anywhere beyond their own immediate valley or fjord. A boat might arrive once every so often, carrying goods and news from further along the coast. A mountain pass might be crossable only during the warmer months, cutting a valley off almost entirely from its nearest neighbours through the long winter. Life in these communities developed its own particular rhythms and, in many cases, its own particular way of speaking, distinct enough from the dialect spoken in the very next valley over that people from these two neighbouring communities might need to slow down and listen carefully to properly understand one another, despite living close enough in absolute distance that a bird could cross between them in a matter of minutes. This is one of the quieter, more remarkable consequences of Norway's fractured, difficult geography. A country roughly the size of many mid-sized nations has developed a genuinely wide variety of distinct regional dialects, shaped in large part by exactly how isolated so many of its communities have historically been from one another, tucked away in their own valleys, behind their own mountains, at the ends of their own long, narrow fjords, developing their own particular way of speaking largely undisturbed by the linguistic influence of communities that might be geographically close but practically distant, separated by a mountain range or a stretch of open water that made regular contact for much of history simply impractical. Even today, with modern roads, tunnels, ferries, and reliable transportation connecting communities that once might have gone months without any real contact with the outside world, this pattern of dispersed, isolated settlement remains a defining feature of the Norwegian landscape. Enormous stretches of the country remain genuinely empty in a way that's difficult to find replicated in most of Western Europe. Valleys where the nearest neighbour might be many kilometres away. Coastal stretches where a single lighthouse or a single small fishing operation might represent the only human presence for a considerable distance in either direction. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over these empty spaces, different from the quiet of a fjord's still water or the quiet of a deep cave, though related to both. It's the quiet of land that was simply never suited to hold very many people. Land that has spent its entire history mostly to itself, visited occasionally, crossed occasionally, but never truly filled, its mountains and valleys stretching out under an open sky with nothing much to interrupt them beyond the occasional grazing animal, the occasional distant sound of water moving somewhere out of sight, the occasional single house standing alone at the edge of a fjord, its lit window the only visible sign for a very long stretch of darkening coastline that anyone lives here at all. In some of these interior valleys, small farms still stand where they've stood for generations, some of them worked by the same family lines for longer than any written record can confirm, their fields clinging to the only patches of level, fertile ground the valley happens to offer, everything else around them too steep, too rocky, or too shaded to support anything beyond wild grass and scattered birch. A farmer in one of these valleys might see the sun disappear behind the western ridge for good in early winter, not to set in the ordinary sense, but simply to vanish behind stone too high for the low winter sun to ever climb over again until the season turns. the valley floor settling into a long, cool shadow for weeks at a time, even while the sky directly above remains bright. And running directly through the heart of this landscape, dividing it in ways that go well beyond simple geography, is a long spine of mountains, the very same mountains responsible for carving the fjords we explored earlier and for leaving so much of the interior unsuitable for farming. These mountains do something else as well, something that shapes the climate, the weather, and even the culture of the country on either side of them in ways distinct enough that Norway sometimes feels, depending on which side of that spine you happen to be standing on, like two entirely different countries occupying the same narrow strip of land. The Scandinavian mountains run for the entire length of Norway, forming a long, continuous ridge that also marks much of the border between Norway and Sweden, separating the wetter, more dramatic western coast, the one holding all of those deep fjords we spent our earlier time exploring, from the drier, gentler eastern regions closer to Sweden. This single mountain range creates two genuinely distinct weather patterns on either side of it, a phenomenon geographers refer to as a rain shadow. Moist air arrives from the Atlantic Ocean, carried inland by the prevailing westerly winds, and as that air encounters the western slopes of the Scandinavian mountains, it's forced upward, cooling as it climbs, and cooling air holds less moisture than warm air, so as it rises and cools, it releases much of the water it was carrying as rain and snow, drenching the western, coastal side of the mountains, with far more precipitation than falls almost anywhere else in the country. By the time that same air has crossed over the mountain peaks and begins descending on the eastern side, it has already released the vast majority of the moisture it was originally carrying. As it descends, it warms again, and this warmer, drier air produces a noticeably different climate on the eastern side of the range, considerably less rainfall, more distinct seasons, colder winters in some respects, but also more consistent, predictable weather overall, lacking the near-constant possibility of rain that defines so much of life along the western coast. Picture standing at a high mountain pass on a day when weather is visibly moving through, watching thick, low cloud rolling in from the west, catching against the western slopes below you, unable to easily climb over the ridge, while behind you, on the eastern side of the very same mountain, the sky remains largely clear, sunlight falling on a landscape that, at that exact moment, might be experiencing an entirely different day weather-wise than the valley, just a short distance away on the opposite side of the ridge. This division has shaped far more than simply how much rain falls in any given region. The wetter western coast, protected somewhat from extreme cold by the same warm ocean current we explored earlier, but exposed constantly to rain and shifting Atlantic weather, developed a particular relationship with the sea, an economy and a culture built heavily around fishing, boats, and the constant negotiation between land and water that defines coastal life almost anywhere. The drier eastern regions, closer to Sweden and further from the moderating influence of the ocean, developed instead a culture more oriented toward forest, farming where the land allowed it, and a somewhat more continental climate, with colder, more consistent winters and warmer, more reliable summers than the coast typically experiences. Because this same mountain range also divides the country into countless individual valleys, each one running down from the central ridge toward either the eastern or western lowlands. The isolation we described earlier in this journey, the isolation responsible for Norway's remarkable variety of local dialects, finds its deepest roots here in the physical separation this mountain spine imposes between one valley and the next. A community on the western side of the range might have historically had far more regular contact, by sea, with other coastal settlements many kilometers up or down the coastline than with a community sitting only a short distance away as measured directly across the mountains, simply because the sea offered a practical route of travel that the mountains themselves refused to provide. Even today, this mountain spine continues to shape how Norwegians experience their own country, a road trip from the western coast to Oslo in the east, still passing through a visibly different landscape and often a visibly different sky within the space of a single day's drive, moving from steep, rain-soaked fjord country through high mountain passes, sometimes still holding snow well into what would be considered summer almost anywhere else, and finally down into the gentler, drier valleys and lowlands surrounding the capital. 3 distinct geographies experienced in sequence, all within the borders of a single, relatively narrow country. High along this same mountain spine, above where any tree can take hold, lie wide, open plateaus that Norwegians call fjell, a landscape of bare rock, thin grass, and scattered snow patches that can linger through the entire summer in shaded hollows, never quite melting before the next winter's snow arrives to bury them again. Reindeer move across these plateaus in loose, unhurried herds, following routes that have likely changed very little across many centuries, grazing on lichen and low alpine plants across a landscape so open and so exposed that a person standing in the middle of it can sometimes see for tens of kilometers in every direction without a single tree, a single building, or another living soul anywhere in. View only rock, sky, and the faint sound of wind finding nothing to interrupt it. We'll leave that mountain spine standing quietly now, holding its rain on one side and its clear skies on the other, the way it has for as long as this landscape has existed in anything like its current form, and we'll move next toward the coast itself, out past the mainland entirely, into a scattering of land so vast and so fragmented that it forms what many who live along this coast simply call a fence. A fence made not of wood or wire, but of tens of thousands of individual islands, standing guard along the entire western edge of the country, absorbing the worst of the open Atlantic before it ever has the chance to reach the mainland shore. Look at a detailed map of Norway's western coastline, zoomed in close enough to show individual pieces of land rather than the broad, simplified shape most maps settle for, and something strange begins to happen. The coastline stops looking like an edge at all. It starts to look more like a shattering, thousands upon thousands of individual fragments of rock scattered across the sea, some large enough to hold small towns and farms, some barely large enough to hold a single house and a short stretch of dock, some nothing more than a bare knuckle of stone breaking the surface, home to nothing but a scattering of seabirds and whatever hardy plant life has managed to take root in the thin soil gathered in its cracks. This is the skærgård, a Norwegian word that translates roughly to something like a rocky fence or a skerry guard, and it isn't a single feature in the way a mountain range or a river is a single feature. It's an entire, almost incomprehensibly vast collection of islands, islets, and pan-submerged rocks running along nearly the full length of Norway's coast, numbering, by most careful counts, somewhere in the range of 50,000 separate pieces of land, though the exact number depends heavily on how small a fragment of rock has to be before it stops counting as an island at all, and where exactly you draw that line changes the total substantially. Picture flying low along this coastline on a clear day, the way we did earlier when we first considered the fjords, only now looking not at the mainland's folded edge, but at the water just beyond it. Instead of open sea, you find a scattered maze of land, channels of water threading between islands of every conceivable size and shape, some channels wide enough for a large ship to pass through comfortably, others so narrow and so shallow that only a small local boat, guided by someone who has learned every twist of that particular channel across a lifetime of use, would ever attempt to navigate them at all. This vast field of islands exists for essentially the same reason the fjords exist, carved and shaped by the same ice that once covered this entire landscape. As the glaciers ground their way toward the sea during the Ice Age, they didn't only carve deep valleys into the mainland. They also carved and scoured the low-lying coastal terrain that would eventually become these islands, grinding away softer rock, leaving behind only the hardest, most resistant fragments of the ancient bedrock we discussed earlier, fragments that, once the ice retreated and the sea rose to claim the land around them, remained standing above the water as separate pieces of land rather than being submerged entirely. Many of these islands, especially the smaller ones, carry the same kind of glacial polish and scarring found on the fjord walls, their exposed rock surfaces worn smooth in places, scratched with faint parallel lines in others, a record of ice that finished its work here at the same time it finished carving the fjords further inland, leaving behind this entire scattered field of stone as one continuous, if fragmented, monument to the same slow, patient process. The purpose this island field serves for the mainland behind it is significant, and it's the reason so many Norwegians speak of the Skjærgård almost as though it were a wall or a fence rather than simply a collection of islands. The open Atlantic, out beyond the outermost islands, can be a genuinely violent stretch of ocean, particularly through the autumn and winter months, when storms rolling in off the sea can build waves large enough to be dangerous for almost any vessel unfortunate enough to be caught out in open water when one arrives. But behind this scattered field of islands, in the network of channels and sheltered bays running between them, the water tends to remain calm even when the open sea beyond is being torn apart by exactly this kind of storm. The islands absorb the worst of the wave energy, breaking it apart against their own rocky shores before it can ever reach the more sheltered water closer to the mainland, allowing boats to travel along much of the coast in relative safety, following these inner channels rather than venturing out into open water, even during weather that would make a direct route along the exposed coastline genuinely dangerous. This has shaped Norwegian coastal life for as long as people have lived along this shore, an entire tradition of navigation built around knowing these channels intimately, understanding which passages remain safe, in which conditions, which shortcuts a small boat might take that a larger vessel never could, which islands offer genuine shelter in a sudden storm, and which only appear to. Generations of fishermen and coastal traders have passed this knowledge down, largely without ever writing it into any formal chart, learned instead the way any deeply practical, deeply local knowledge is learned, through years of simply being out on the water, watching how the current moves through a particular gap between two islands, noticing where the wind tends to funnel unexpectedly hard, remembering which rocks lie just beneath the surface at low tide, invisible until a boat's hull finds them the hard way. Life on the smallest of these islands, the ones supporting only a single household or a small handful of them, developed its own particular character, shaped almost entirely by isolation and by an unusually direct, unmediated relationship with the sea. Picture a single house standing on a small, treeless skerry, its walls painted the deep red or white so commonly seen along this coast, a single boat tied at a small dock below it, the nearest neighbouring island visible in the distance but reachable only by that same small boat, weather permitting. A family living in a place like this for generations would have organised nearly every aspect of daily life around what the sea allowed on any given day. Fishing wasn't a choice or a hobby. It was the primary, and often the only, source of both food and income, and the sea's mood on any particular morning, whether it was calm enough to safely head out, whether a change in the wind meant returning early, whether the coming weeks looked likely to bring the kind of storms that would keep every boat tied firmly at the dock, dictated the rhythm of the entire household far more directly than any calendar or clock ever could. Some of these small, isolated islands became home to something slightly different from an ordinary fishing family. Structures built not to house people living an ordinary life, but to serve a single, specific, and genuinely vital purpose, warning ships away from the exact rocks that made this entire coastline so beautiful and so treacherous at the very same time. Norway's lighthouses, scattered across some of the most exposed and isolated points along this fractured coast, represent one of the more solitary forms of human habitation to be found anywhere in the country. Many were built on tiny islands holding nothing else at all. No farmland, no natural shelter. Sometimes barely enough flat ground to support the lighthouse itself and the small keeper's residence beside it, chosen for exactly the quality that made them otherwise unlivable. Their isolated position at the very edge of danger, precisely where an approaching ship most needed a clear, unmistakable warning. For a very long stretch of Norwegian history, before lighthouses were automated and left to operate largely on their own, these remote posts were staffed by keepers who lived, often with their families, in a state of isolation difficult to properly imagine from almost anywhere else in ordinary life. Supply boats might arrive only occasionally, weather permitting, bringing food, mail, and news from the mainland, and then departing again, leaving the keeper and their family alone with the sea, the rock, and the light itself, a light that had to be tended and kept burning without fail, night after night, regardless of storm, regardless of season, regardless of how difficult or how lonely that particular stretch of time happened to feel. Picture one of these lighthouse keepers on a winter evening, climbing the narrow spiral stairs inside the lighthouse tower as the light outside fades into the long Arctic dusk, checking the mechanism that keeps the light rotating, refilling whatever fuel the lamp required in whatever era they happen to be keeping it, and then looking out through the lantern room's windows at absolutely nothing but dark, heaving water in every direction, no other light visible anywhere along the horizon except, perhaps, very far in the distance, the answering glow of another lighthouse doing exactly the same work on its own isolated rock, the two lights acknowledging each other across the dark water without either needing to say anything at all, simply continuing their shared task through the night the way they always had. This life demanded a particular kind of person and a particular kind of family, capable of finding genuine contentment in a solitude that most people would find genuinely difficult to endure for any real length of time. And yet many lighthouse families remained at their posts for years, sometimes for decades, raising children on islands so small and so remote that those children's earliest understanding of the world was built almost entirely around rock, sea, weather, and the single, patient light their family was responsible for keeping alive through every night, regardless of what that night happened to bring. Most of Norway's lighthouses have since been automated, the light itself now maintained by machinery rather than by a family living beside it around the clock, and many of the small keepers' residences that once housed those families now stand empty, or have been converted into guest houses for the relatively small number of visitors curious enough to seek out one of these isolated posts for themselves. Spending a night in a place built originally not for comfort or tourism, but for the single, unglamorous purpose of keeping ships away from rocks that had already claimed more vessels than anyone kept a careful count of. Not every settlement within this scattered field of islands was quite so isolated as a single lighthouse keeper's family, though. Certain islands, blessed with slightly more usable land, a slightly more sheltered harbour, or simply a slightly more convenient position along an important fishing route, grew into small but genuine fishing communities, clusters of houses and docks supporting dozens or sometimes hundreds of people, entire lives lived almost entirely within sight of the same stretch of water, the same nearby islands, the same particular quality of light that this far northern coast produces at every hour of the day and every season of the year. Picture one of these small island fishing hubs on an ordinary morning, boats leaving the harbour before full daylight has properly arrived, engines carrying easily across water this calm and this enclosed, gulls already gathering in anticipation of whatever the returning catch might eventually offer them. The houses climbing the low hillside above the harbour tend toward the same deep, weathered red so common along this entire coast, a colour originally chosen many generations ago because the iron oxide used to produce it was cheap and plentiful, and one that has since become so deeply associated with Norwegian coastal life that the colour itself now feels inseparable from the landscape it was originally, applied to almost as an afterthought. Life in a community like this remains, even now, tied closely to the rhythms of the sea and the fish that move through the surrounding waters in their own seasonal patterns. Communities that have organised entire local calendars around the arrival of particular fish stocks at particular times of year, festivals and traditions built around a catch that, for centuries, represented the difference between a prosperous winter and a genuinely difficult one. And scattered among all of this, the small hubs and the isolated lighthouses, and the countless bare, uninhabited rocks holding nothing but seabirds and hardy coastal plants, this entire field of islands performs one more function worth pausing over before we leave it behind for the night. It creates, in the channels and sheltered waters running between the islands, an entire secondary coastline, one running parallel to the mainland's own dramatically folded edge, doubling and in some sense multiplying the sheer scale and complexity of the landscape we tried, back at the very beginning of this journey, to properly measure. That original coastline paradox we explored, the impossible task of ever arriving at a single, final length for Norway's shore, becomes even more pronounced once you account for these islands properly, each one adding its own small stretch of additional coastline, its own folds and inlets and rocky points, scattered across 50,000 separate fragments of land, each one contributing just a little, more length to a total that was already, before any of these islands were even considered, effectively impossible to pin down with any real finality. We'll leave this scattered fence of islands resting quietly in the dark now, their rocky shapes barely visible against the water except where a single lit window, somewhere out on one of the larger ones, marks the presence of a family settling in for the night. And we'll turn now towards something that has nothing to do with land or water at all, something governed instead by the tilt of the earth itself, and by this country's position so far toward the top of the planet that its relationship with daylight follows rules unlike almost anywhere else most people have ever lived. There is a particular kind of disorientation that visitors to the far north of Norway sometimes describe during the summer months, one that has very little to do with unfamiliar food or unfamiliar language, and everything to do with something far more basic than either. The sun, in the deep of a northern Norwegian summer, simply doesn't set, not for a single night, not for weeks at a time in some of the more northern parts of the country. The sun climbs into the sky each morning the way it always has, moves across the sky through the day the way it always has, and then, rather than dropping below the horizon as evening arrives, it simply continues along a low, shallow arc, brushing close to the horizon without ever quite touching it, before beginning to climb again, starting a new day without any true night ever having occurred in between. This is the midnight sun, and it happens because of the same basic tilt of the Earth's axis responsible for seasons everywhere on the planet, though nowhere does that tilt produce quite so striking a result as it does at these high latitudes. The Earth doesn't spin perfectly upright relative to its orbit around the sun. It leans, tilted at a consistent angle, and as it travels around the sun over the course of a year, different parts of the planet end up tilted either toward or away from the sun's light depending on the time of year. In the middle latitudes, where most of the world's population lives, this tilt produces the ordinary rhythm of longer summer days and shorter winter days that most people are already familiar with, but the sun still rises and sets every single day regardless of season, simply spending more or less time above the horizon depending on the time of year. But far enough north, close enough to the pole itself, the tilt becomes extreme enough that during the peak of summer, when that particular hemisphere is tilted as far toward the sun as it will get all year, the sun never actually dips below the horizon at all for a continuous stretch of days, weeks, or in the most extreme northern locations, months. The exact duration of this continuous daylight depends on precisely how far north you happen to be, growing longer the closer you get to the pole itself, until at the pole exactly, the sun would remain above the horizon continuously for half the entire year, rising once around the spring equinox and not setting again until the autumn equinox arrives many months later. Picture standing somewhere well north of the Arctic Circle in the middle of a Norwegian summer, at an hour that would, almost anywhere else in the world, be deep in the middle of the night. The sky isn't dark at all. The sun sits low, close to the horizon, its light taking on the same warm, golden quality that ordinary sunsets produce almost anywhere on Earth, except that this particular golden light simply persists, hour after hour, the sun never quite completing the descent that would normally end a day and begin a night. Shadows stretch long and low across the landscape, exactly the way they would just before an ordinary sunset, and yet, if you check the time, it might read 2 or 3 in the morning, the light around you giving no indication whatsoever that this is meant to be the deepest, darkest part of the day. This constant light changes the rhythm of life in these northern communities in ways that take some adjustment even for people who have lived with it their entire lives. Children playing outside well past what would, at almost any other latitude, be considered a very late bedtime, simply because there's no darkening sky to signal that the day is meant to be winding down. Fishing boats heading out at hours that would seem strange anywhere else, taking advantage of daylight that, during these particular weeks, is available at literally every hour, allowing an entirely different relationship with time and work than exists almost anywhere further south. Visitors to this part of the world during the midnight sun season often describe a particular kind of exhaustion that creeps up on them after a few days. Not from any single event, but simply from the accumulated effect of a body that relies, at some deep and largely unconscious level, on darkness to signal that it's time to rest, suddenly finding that signal removed entirely, night after night, for as long as the visit lasts. Many hotels and homes in this part of Norway are built with heavy curtains, specifically designed to block out this persistent daylight, allowing residents and visitors alike to create an artificial darkness inside their own rooms, even while the actual sky outside their window remains fully bright at every hour. But this same axial tilt that grants these northern regions such an extraordinary abundance of summer daylight extracts an equally extraordinary price during the opposite half of the year, once the Earth's orbit has carried that same hemisphere around to the point where it now tilts away from the sun instead of toward it. This is the polar night, and it represents the precise inverse of everything the midnight sun offers, weeks or months, again depending on exact latitude, during which the sun never rises above the horizon at all, the sky remaining in a state of persistent twilight or true darkness through even the middle of the day, when the sun, at almost any other time of year, would be sitting high overhead. Picture the far north of Norway in the deepest part of winter, at what would ordinarily be considered midday, noon exactly, the hour when the sun should be at its highest point in the sky. Instead, the horizon holds only a faint, pale glow, low and diffuse, the sun itself never actually climbing high enough to properly clear the horizon at all, its light filtered through the same low, indirect angle that, further south, would only ever be experienced briefly, right around sunrise or sunset. This pale, indirect light might last for only a few hours in the middle of the day, before fading back into a darkness that then persists for the remainder of the 24-hour cycle. an entire day experienced almost as a single long stretch of dimness bracketed by true night on either side. The character of this darkness changes gradually as the polar night deepens through the heart of winter. In the early weeks, before the sun has dropped entirely below the horizon for good, there's still a meaningful period of twilight around midday, enough indirect light to see clearly outdoors, even if the sun itself never quite makes an appearance. But at the very deepest point of the polar night, in the areas furthest north, even that midday twilight fades to something closer to true darkness, relieved only by whatever moonlight or starlight happens to be available on a particular night, or, as we'll explore shortly, by another kind of light entirely, one that has nothing to do with the sun at all. Life during the polar night takes on its own particular rhythm, shaped by artificial light in a way that summer life, flooded with midnight sun, never needs to be. Streetlights and window lights become the primary markers of a community's presence for weeks at a stretch. A small fishing town visible from a distance at what would be midday almost anywhere else in the world, its warm electric glow the only real indication that anyone lives there at all, set against a landscape and a sky both settled into the same deep, persistent blue-grey twilight. And yet, communities that have lived with this cycle for generations rarely describe the polar night in the purely bleak terms an outsider might expect. Many speak, instead of a particular kind of coziness that settles over this season, an intentional slowing down, gathering indoors with warm light and good company, treating the darkness less as an absence to be endured and more as an invitation toward rest, reflection, and a kind of deliberate stillness that the relentless daylight of summer never really allows for. Certain Norwegian communities even hold small festivals specifically built around the darkest point of the polar night, marking the turn of the season, the promise that however dark this particular stretch of the year has become, the light is already, slowly and invisibly, beginning its long return. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this entire extreme cycle, months of unbroken daylight followed by months of unbroken darkness, exists purely as a consequence of a tilt in the Earth's axis so small, relative to the scale of the planet itself, that it can be difficult to properly visualize at all. And yet that small, consistent lean is entirely responsible for the particular rhythm of life we've just described. An entire population organizing itself, season after season, generation after generation, around a light cycle that most of the world never experiences in anything like this extreme a form, learning, across a very long history of living this far north, how to find rest in darkness that never fully arrives in summer, and how to find warmth and light in a winter that offers barely any of either from the sky itself. We'll leave this long cycle of light and dark settling here for the night, the way it has settled over this landscape for as long as the Earth has held its current tilt, and we'll turn next towards something that appears, on certain nights, directly within that same deep polar darkness, colour moving quietly across the sky above the fjords, born not of any sunrise or sunset, but of something arriving from far beyond the Earth itself. On certain clear nights, deep within the polar night we just finished describing, or even during the darker hours of the shoulder seasons when true night still briefly returns, something begins to happen directly overhead that has nothing at all to do with the sun's ordinary rising and setting, nothing to do with reflected moonlight, nothing to do with any light source a person standing on the ground could ever point to or explain simply by looking around them. The sky itself begins to move. Not the clouds, and not the stars, which continue their own slow, familiar wheel around the pole exactly as they always do. Something else, layered above all of that, faint at first, easy to mistake for a particularly pale, oddly shaped cloud if you aren't already watching closely. A soft curtain of green light, sometimes tinged at its edges with a deeper violet or a faint rose, hanging in the sky the way a curtain might hang in a doorway, except that this curtain has no fixed shape at all. It ripples. It folds back on itself. It brightens in one section while dimming in another. The whole shifting form moving with a slowness that feels almost deliberate, as though something enormous and patient were testing the folds of a great, silent piece of fabric stretched across the entire visible sky. This is the aurora borealis, the northern lights, and along the fjords and mountains of Norway, particularly in the northern regions where the polar night settles in most completely, it appears often enough and clearly enough that entire communities have shaped parts of their winter life around simply going outside to watch it. The explanation for what's actually happening, when you trace it back far enough, begins not in the sky above Norway at all, but at the sun, 93 million miles away, and specifically in the sun's own turbulent, constantly shifting magnetic activity. The sun doesn't simply sit quietly in space, radiating light and heat in some smooth, unchanging way. Its surface churns constantly, twisted by magnetic fields far more powerful and far more chaotic than anything found naturally on Earth. And every so often, some disturbance in that magnetic activity releases a burst of charged particles outward into space, a stream of electrically charged matter that astronomers call the solar wind. This isn't a rare or occasional event. The sun is releasing this stream of particles more or less constantly in varying intensity, and Earth, along with every other planet in the solar system, sits directly in the path of at least some portion of it. Most of the time, these charged particles never reach the Earth's surface at all, deflected harmlessly away by the planet's own magnetic field, an invisible protective shell surrounding the entire Earth, generated deep within the planet's molten interior and extending far out into space, well beyond the atmosphere itself. This magnetic field acts something like an enormous, invisible umbrella, redirecting most of the charged particles arriving from the sun around the planet rather than allowing them to strike directly into the atmosphere below. But the Earth's magnetic field isn't shaped like a perfectly even, uniform shell. It's compressed on the side facing the sun and stretched out into a long, trailing shape on the side facing away. And more importantly for our purposes tonight, it funnels down toward the surface most directly at two specific points, the magnetic poles, one near the north and one near the south, which sit close to, but not perfectly aligned with, the geographic poles that mark the actual axis the Earth spins around. At these two funnel points, some of the charged particles arriving from the solar wind are guided down along the Earth's own magnetic field lines, spiraling inward toward the upper atmosphere in these two specific polar regions rather than being deflected away entirely. This is why the aurora appears reliably in a band of latitudes surrounding each pole and almost nowhere else on the planet under ordinary conditions, a ring-shaped zone where the Earth's own magnetic architecture happens to funnel this cosmic particle stream directly down toward breathable air. Once these charged particles reach the upper atmosphere, somewhere between about 60 and 200 miles above the surface, they begin colliding with the gas molecules that make up our air, primarily oxygen and nitrogen. These collisions transfer energy into the gas molecules, exciting their electrons into a temporarily higher energy state. And when those electrons settle back down to their normal, resting state a moment later, they release that extra energy as light, a specific color of light determined almost entirely by which gas absorbed the energy in the first place and at what altitude the collision occurred. Oxygen, when struck at the higher altitudes typical of most auroral displays, tends to release a green light, the colour most commonly associated with the northern lights and the one most often visible to the naked eye, since green sits near the peak of human colour sensitivity in low light conditions. At even higher altitudes, oxygen can instead produce a deep red glow, though this tends to appear only during the most intense auroral activity, since it requires enough particles reaching high enough into a thinner part of the atmosphere to trigger it. Nitrogen, meanwhile, tends to produce the blues and purples sometimes visible along the lower edges or fringes of an auroral display, a colour contributed by a different gas responding to the same basic physical process happening at a slightly different altitude and with a slightly different energy involved. Picture, now, actually standing beneath one of these displays, somewhere along the Norwegian coast, perhaps at the edge of a fjord where the still water below can double the light show reflected across its surface, the way it doubled every mountain we described earlier in this journey. The night is cold enough that your breath shows clearly in front of you. The sky above holds an ordinary scattering of stars, familiar and fixed, and then, gradually, or sometimes with startling suddenness, a pale band of green begins forming somewhere along the northern horizon. Faint enough at first that you might genuinely question whether you're actually seeing anything at all, or simply imagining a shape in what could just as easily be a very thin, high cloudlet somehow from below. But then it moves. The pale band brightens, and rather than holding still the way a cloud would, it begins to ripple, folding gently along its own length, brightening in one section while another section dims, the entire shape sliding slowly sideways across the sky the way a curtain sways when someone walks past it in another room. And then, sometimes, the display intensifies dramatically, the pale green deepening into something far more vivid, additional colours emerging at its edges, the whole curtain seeming to fold and refold itself with an increasing urgency, moving now not slowly but almost dancing, shifting shape every few seconds, occasionally splitting into multiple separate bands moving independently of each other across different parts of the sky at once. The silence that accompanies all of this is, for many people watching it for the first time, almost as striking as the light itself. Something this dramatic, this visually overwhelming, happening directly overhead and yet producing no sound whatsoever. Just the ordinary silence of a cold winter night, occasionally broken only by your own breathing, or by the soft creak of ice somewhere along the fjord's edge, while far above, an entirely silent performance continues, indifferent to whether anyone is standing below to watch it or not. People who live along this coast and have watched this display across an entire lifetime often describe a particular relationship with it that outsiders, arriving specifically, hoping to see the northern lights for the first and perhaps only time in their lives, rarely have the chance to develop. For a long-time resident, the aurora isn't a rare spectacle to be chased and hoped for. It's simply a feature of the winter sky, present often enough that stepping outside on a clear, dark evening and glancing upward becomes something close to habit, checking almost the way you might check the weather, curious whether tonight happens to be one of the nights the lights have chosen to appear, and if so, how bright, how active, how worth stepping fully outside for rather than simply glancing through a window before returning to whatever warm activity was already underway indoors. There is a long tradition among the various communities who have lived beneath this display for generations of stories built around trying to explain what this light actually was, long before anyone understood anything about solar wind or magnetic fields or excited electrons releasing photons as they returned to a lower energy state. Some older Norwegian folklore described the lights as reflections cast by enormous shoals of herring swimming somewhere out in the dark sea, their silvery scales somehow catching and throwing light up into the sky above them. Other traditions, found among various northern peoples across this same general region, treated the lights with a more careful, sometimes more solemn regard, understanding them as something closer to the presence of ancestors, or as a phenomenon dangerous to mock or disrespect too openly. Children in some communities taught, even in relatively recent generations, to behave with a certain quiet respect, on nights when the lights were especially active, just in case. None of these older explanations survive the scrutiny of modern science, but there's something worth appreciating in how directly they responded to the same basic experience anyone standing beneath the aurora still has today. A sky doing something it has no ordinary business doing, moving and glowing and shifting with no visible source, no explanation immediately available simply by looking around at the landscape below it. Long before anyone could describe the solar wind or the Earth's magnetic field with any real precision, people living beneath this same sky still recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary and did what people generally do when faced with the extraordinary and unexplained. They built stories around it, trying to give some shape and some meaning to a light that otherwise simply arrived, danced, and faded again into the ordinary dark, without ever explaining itself to anyone standing below. The aurora doesn't appear on every clear night. Of course, its intensity and frequency tied directly back to how active the sun happens to be at any given point in its own long, roughly 11-year cycle of rising and falling magnetic activity. During periods when the sun is particularly active, releasing stronger and more frequent bursts of charged particles, the aurora tends to appear more often and more intensely, sometimes visible even from locations further south than it would ordinarily reach, briefly extending its usual polar range further down across the sky than communities in those regions are used to seeing it. During quieter stretches of the solar cycle, displays become less frequent and generally less intense, though even during these calmer years, the far north of Norway still sees the lights often enough that a patient visitor, willing to spend several clear nights actually watching the sky rather than simply hoping for a single lucky glimpse, stands a genuinely good chance of witnessing at least one real display before their visit ends. And there is one more quiet detail worth carrying forward from this part of the story, because it connects directly back to something we explored earlier in this same journey. The same warm ocean current responsible for keeping Norway's Arctic harbours free of ice through the winter also, indirectly, makes this a genuinely comfortable place to stand outside and watch the aurora, at least by the standards of other locations at a similar latitude. A clear winter night along this coast is cold, certainly, but rarely cold enough to make an extended period spent standing still outdoors, waiting patiently for the lights to appear, into the kind of genuinely dangerous undertaking it might become at the same latitude somewhere far from any moderating ocean influence. The same warmth that keeps the ports open also, quietly, makes the whole experience of watching the sky above them just a little more bearable than the latitude alone would ever suggest. We'll leave the aurora resting now, fading slowly back into ordinary darkness the way it always eventually does. Its performance finished for tonight, though certain to return again on some other clear evening not too far in the future, and we'll travel now further north still, past even the northernmost fjords and lighthouses we've already visited, out into open Arctic water, toward a territory that belongs to Norway, and yet feels, in almost every meaningful sense, like an entirely different world altogether. Far north of the Norwegian mainland, well beyond where any of the coastline or islands we've explored so far actually reach, lies a scattered group of islands sitting deep within the high Arctic, closer to the North Pole than to Oslo, a territory called Svalbard, and it represents, in almost every way that matters, the furthest and strangest extension of Norway's already strange geography. Svalbard sits at a latitude where the ordinary rules governing where people can comfortably live begin to break down almost entirely. Winters here are long, dark, and genuinely severe, deep within the same polar night we described earlier, only extended further and intensified further than anywhere along the mainland coast experiences it. Summers, brief as they are, bring the same midnight sun, though even at its warmest, the climate here remains defined by permanent snow and ice, covering a significant portion of the landscape year-round, glaciers filling entire valleys, sea ice forming and breaking apart across the surrounding waters on its own seasonal rhythm. And yet people do live here, in a small handful of settlements scattered across this otherwise largely uninhabited Arctic territory, the largest of them home to a population that, even at its peak, numbers only in the low thousands. A genuinely small human presence set against an otherwise overwhelming landscape of rock, ice, and open Arctic water. One detail about Svalbard tends to capture people's attention more immediately than almost anything else about the place. A simple, striking fact repeated often enough that it's become something close to the territory's defining characteristic. Polar bears here significantly outnumber the human population, wandering across an enormous, largely untouched landscape that remains, in every meaningful sense, still fundamentally their territory rather than anyone else's, with the small human settlements existing here more as tolerated guests within bear country than as the primary occupants of the land. This isn't simply a colourful exaggeration. Anyone leaving the immediate vicinity of Svalbard's main settlement is required, by law, to carry a firearm or travel with someone who does, specifically because of the very real possibility of encountering a polar bear at almost any point outside the town's limits. An encounter that, given the animal's size, its predatory nature, and its complete indifference to human presence in a landscape it has, always considered entirely its own, can become genuinely dangerous with very little warning. Picture standing at the edge of Svalbard's main town on a clear day. The settlement itself, a small, colourful cluster of buildings holding onto a narrow strip of habitable ground between the shoreline and the surrounding mountains, and beyond that narrow strip, in every direction, an enormous, empty, ice-covered wilderness stretching out toward a horizon broken only by more mountains, more glaciers, more open water further out to sea. The scale of the emptiness here exceeds even the empty valleys and quiet coastal stretches of the Norwegian mainland we described earlier, a landscape that makes the mainland's own isolation feel, by comparison, almost crowded and familiar. The ground itself in Svalbard tells its own particular story, locked as it is in permanent ground ice, permafrost extending down for a considerable depth beneath the surface across almost the entire territory, thawing only in a thin surface layer during the brief summer months before refreezing solid again as autumn returns. Buildings here are constructed with this permafrost carefully in mind, often raised up on stilts or pilings specifically to prevent the heat radiating from an occupied structure from thawing the frozen ground directly beneath it, since a building resting directly on permafrost risks slowly sinking, unevenly and unpredictably, as the ground beneath it softens from the warmth leaking downward from above. It is this same permanently frozen ground, cold enough and stable enough to remain reliably frozen across almost any conceivable span of time, that led to one of the more remarkable and quietly consequential decisions made anywhere in the modern world, a decision to use this remote Arctic stone not for housing people at all, but for protecting something considerably more fragile and, in a certain sense, considerably more valuable than any single building or settlement. Carved directly into the frozen rock of a mountainside near Svalbard's main settlement lies the Global Seed Vault, a facility built with a singular purpose: to hold, in long-term deep freeze, seed samples representing an enormous share of the world's crop diversity, a kind of insurance policy against the possibility that any particular crop variety might someday be lost elsewhere in the world, whether through war, natural disaster, disease, or simply the slow, ordinary attrition of agricultural varieties gradually falling out of use and eventually disappearing entirely as farming practices shift and change across generations. The vault's location here isn't accidental or purely symbolic. It takes direct advantage of Svalbard's permafrost, the same permanently frozen ground responsible for how buildings here have to be constructed, providing a natural, passive cooling effect that would keep the seeds stored inside reliably frozen even if, for whatever reason, the vault's own mechanical refrigeration systems were to fail entirely. The rock itself does a significant share of the preservation work here, simply by being as cold and as consistently, dependably frozen as it has been for longer than any human record can properly confirm. Picture the inside of that mountain. Deep beneath the surface, in a chamber sealed away from almost everything happening in the world outside it. Shelf after shelf holding small, sealed packages of seeds, each one labelled, catalogued, and deposited here specifically so that, whatever else might happen elsewhere on the planet, this particular variety of wheat or rice or barley or any of the thousands of other crop varieties represented here would still exist somewhere, safe, cold, and simply waiting, the way so much of what we've explored throughout this entire journey has always simply waited, patient and largely unnoticed, for whatever future eventually arrives to make use of it. There is a particular kind of quiet reassurance in the existence of a place like this, tucked away in one of the most remote and outwardly hostile corners of an already remote and challenging country, doing its patient work almost entirely out of public view, visited only occasionally by the researchers and officials responsible for adding to or checking on its contents, otherwise simply sitting inside. Its frozen mountain, holding, in a very real sense, a significant portion of humanity's entire agricultural future, protected by nothing more elaborate at its most basic level than very cold, very old, very reliable Arctic stone. Life in Svalbard's small settlements carries its own particular character, shaped by an isolation that goes beyond even what we described earlier along the mainland's more remote coastal stretches. Supplies arrive by ship or by air, weather and ice conditions permitting, and the small population living here, drawn from various backgrounds and various countries under the particular international arrangements governing this unusual territory, has built a genuine, functioning community despite existing at what feels, by almost any ordinary measure, like the very edge of where a permanent human settlement can reasonably exist at all. Children born and raised in Svalbard grow up with an understanding of the natural world built around realities that would seem extraordinary almost anywhere else, learning from an early age about polar bear safety alongside more ordinary childhood lessons, experiencing the same extremes of midnight sun and polar night as the mainland but intensified further by the additional distance north, watching the aurora dance overhead through a winter sky, even darker and even more completely isolated from artificial light pollution than most of the mainland communities we described earlier ever experience. And beyond the edges of Svalbard's small settlements, the wider territory continues its own ancient, largely undisturbed rhythms, almost entirely independent of the small human presence tucked into its margins. Glaciers carve enormous pieces of ice into the surrounding fjords with a sound like distant thunder, sending waves rippling outward across water cold enough to be genuinely dangerous to anyone who might fall into it unprepared. Walrus haul themselves onto rocky beaches in loose, noisy groups, indifferent to almost everything except each other and the occasional need to return to the water. Arctic foxes move across the tundra in their own seasonal colour changes, white through the long winter, a darker brown through the brief Arctic summer, hunting whatever small prey the harsh landscape happens to offer at any given time of year. This is Norway's furthest reach, a territory that stretches the definition of the country itself almost to its breaking point, holding within its borders a landscape and a set of living conditions that share almost nothing in common with the gentler farmland around Oslo we described earlier in this journey, and yet remains, in every formal and practical sense, simply another part of the same nation, whose fjords, mountains, and endless folded coastline we've been slowly moving through all evening. We'll leave Svalbard resting now in whatever combination of daylight or darkness currently happens to be settled over it, its glaciers continuing their own slow, patient work regardless of the hour, its seed vault holding its quiet, frozen collection deep inside the mountain, and we'll turn back southward now, toward the mainland once more, to spend some time with a people whose relationship with this landscape, and particularly with its wide, open reindeer country stretching across the high plateaus we glimpsed briefly earlier, reaches back further than almost any other continuous human presence in this part of the world. Long before Norway existed as a country in any sense a mapmaker would recognize, long before its borders were drawn, before its harbours were charted, before anyone spoke of fjords or skerries or the particular quality of light found at this latitude, people were already living across the far north of this landscape, following a rhythm shaped not around any national boundary but around the movement of a single animal across a vast, largely undivided expanse of tundra and mountain. These are the Sami, an indigenous people whose presence in this region reaches back for thousands of years, spread across what is today northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and a portion of Russia, a homeland the Sami themselves generally refer to as Sapmi, a territory that has never fully matched the political borders drawn across it by the various nations that eventually claimed pieces of this same land as their own. At the centre of traditional Sami life, for longer than any written record can properly trace, sits the reindeer, an animal whose own seasonal movement across this harsh, open landscape shaped almost everything about how Sami communities have historically lived, travelled, and organised their understanding of the year itself. Picture a herd of reindeer moving across one of the high plateaus we glimpsed briefly earlier in this journey. Hundreds of animals spread out across an open, treeless expanse of rock, lichen, and thin grass, their pace unhurried but constant, grazing as they go, gradually working their way across the landscape in a direction that shifts season by season according to a pattern of migration these animals have followed for longer than anyone has been keeping count. In summer, the herds move toward higher ground and toward the coast, where cooler temperatures and stronger winds offer some relief from the biting insects that plague lower, more sheltered ground during the brief Arctic warm season. In winter, they move back down into more sheltered valleys and forests, where snow tends to be lighter, and where the lichen the reindeer depend on for winter food remains more accessible beneath a thinner covering of snow than it would be on the fully exposed high plateau. Traditional Sami life followed this same seasonal rhythm almost exactly, entire communities moving alongside their herds across the year, structuring their lives not around a fixed calendar in the way most of the world understands one, but around 8 distinct seasons recognized in traditional Sami understanding, each one tied directly to a particular stage in the reindeer's own annual cycle, a finer, more specific division of the year than the 4 seasons most other cultures settle for, reflecting just how closely daily life here was woven into the precise, gradual shifts of an Arctic year that doesn't divide itself neatly into the broader seasons familiar further south. There is early spring when the snow begins its first tentative retreat and the reindeer, heavily pregnant after the long winter, begin moving back toward their calving grounds. There is spring proper, when calves are born across the open tundra, tiny and vulnerable, finding their legs within hours of birth out of pure necessity in a landscape offering no real shelter from anything that might threaten them. There is early summer, and summer itself, when the herds reach their highest, coolest grazing grounds, and the brief Arctic warmth allows plants across the tundra to grow and flower with a speed that would seem almost frantic anywhere else, compressing an entire growing season into just a handful of intensely productive weeks. Then autumn begins its own slow arrival, and early autumn gives way to autumn proper, the herds beginning their return journey toward lower ground as the days shorten and the first true cold begins settling back across the landscape. And finally, winter itself arrives, the longest and most demanding of these 8 seasons. The herds settled into their more sheltered winter grazing grounds, the entire community organizing itself around the challenge of simply enduring the deep cold and long darkness we described earlier in this journey, waiting for the cycle to eventually turn back towards spring once again. This deep, practical knowledge of the reindeer's needs and of the landscape's own particular rhythm across an entire year represents a kind of expertise built up across countless generations of direct, continuous experience. Knowledge that was never written down in any formal sense for most of its history, but passed instead from parent to child, from elder to younger herder, through direct example, and through stories carrying practical wisdom folded quietly inside them. The way so much traditional knowledge across the world has always been passed along, not through books, but through lived experience shared directly between people who depended on getting these details right, because a mistake in understanding the herd's needs or the landscape's dangers could mean genuine hardship for an entire community. Picture a Sami herder standing at the edge of a winter grazing ground, reading the surface of the snow the way someone else might read a familiar piece of writing, noticing details that would mean nothing at all to an untrained eye, but that carry real, practical significance to someone who has spent a lifetime learning to interpret them. A slightly different texture on the snow's surface might indicate a recent thaw and refreeze, creating a hard crust that reindeer would struggle to break through to reach the lichen beneath, a serious concern in a landscape where that lichen represents essentially the only food source available through the entire winter. The particular quality of light at a given hour, the direction and strength of the wind, the behavior of the herd itself, animals shifting restlessly in one direction or bunching together tightly in response to some threat or discomfort not yet obvious to a human observer standing nearby. All of this forms a kind of continuous, detailed reading of the immediate environment, a skill built from years of direct experience rather than from any single lesson that could simply be explained in words and then set aside as learned. Some Sami families still speak of specific named terms for snow conditions passed down through this same oral tradition, distinct words describing snow that has crusted hard enough to injure a reindeer's leg if it breaks through unexpectedly, snow soft and deep enough to genuinely exhaust a herd forced to travel through it, snow recently fallen and still loose enough for easy digging, each term carrying practical, immediate meaning for anyone responsible for a herd's welfare. A vocabulary built entirely around the specific, repeated needs of this one particular way of life, refined and narrowed across generations until it could describe distinctions in snow that a language shaped by any other landscape would never have needed words for at all. The physical work of traditional reindeer herding demanded an intimate, practical relationship with a landscape that offers very little natural shelter or convenience. Herders traditionally moved with their animals across enormous distances, sometimes covering hundreds of kilometers over the course of a single year's full migration cycle, living for extended stretches in temporary shelters suited to a life that couldn't remain fixed in one place for very long. Structures designed to be raised and taken down quickly, built from materials light enough to be transported, yet sturdy enough to offer genuine protection against Arctic wind and cold. This nomadic, herd-following way of life inevitably brought Sami communities into direct, ongoing contact with the same wide range of Arctic conditions we've already spent time exploring throughout this entire journey, the same midnight sun and polar night cycle experienced by every other community this far north, the same aurora dancing overhead through the long winter darkness, the same brutal cold, moderated only slightly in the more coastal areas by the same warm ocean current that keeps Norway's harbours from freezing. But where a fishing community organised its relationship with this landscape around the sea and its own particular rhythms, Sami communities organised theirs around the open land itself and around an animal whose own instincts and needs had to be understood and respected with an almost complete, practical thoroughness in order for the herd and the community depending on it to survive across generation. After generation of Arctic winters, reindeer provided far more than simply a source of food for traditional Sami communities, though meat certainly formed an important part of what the herd offered. Hide provided material for clothing and for the coverings of the temporary shelters used during seasonal migration. Each piece worked and prepared using techniques refined across generations to produce garments capable of genuinely protecting against cold that would otherwise be dangerous or even lethal to face unprotected. Antler and bone provided material for tools, implements shaped and carved for specific practical purposes, everything from needles to more elaborate crafted items, each one representing a careful, practiced use of whatever the herd itself provided, waste minimized, not out of any particular abstract philosophy, but simply because survival in this landscape depended on making full, careful use of every resource actually available. There is a particular kind of relationship embedded in this way of living, one worth pausing over quietly for a moment, a relationship between a people and an animal that goes well beyond simple ownership or use in the way those words are often understood elsewhere. Traditional Sami understanding of reindeer herding involved working with the herd's own natural instincts and movements, rather than attempting to fully control or override them. Guiding rather than forcing, understanding the animal's own patterns closely enough to work alongside them through an entire year's cycle, rather than imposing some entirely separate human schedule onto creatures whose own needs, left unaddressed, would simply lead the herd to struggle and decline regardless of what any human community wanted from them. This traditional way of life has not remained entirely unchanged across the centuries, of course, and it would be inaccurate to describe modern Sami communities as existing in some kind of frozen, unaltered continuation of practices exactly as they existed hundreds of years ago. Modern technology has changed many practical aspects of contemporary reindeer herding. Snowmobiles and other vehicles now often used to help herders cover the vast distances their migrations require. Radio and satellite tracking sometimes employed to help locate herds spread across enormous stretches of remote terrain, and many Sami families today live in more conventional, permanent housing for at least part of the year rather than following the fully nomadic pattern that once defined this way of life almost entirely. And yet the fundamental relationship between Sami communities and their reindeer herds, and between Sami communities and this particular Arctic landscape, has persisted in its essential character even as its specific practical details have evolved alongside the modern world surrounding it. The 8 seasons still mark the practical rhythm of the herding year for many Sami families. The deep, detailed knowledge of snow conditions, of grazing land, of the particular behavior and needs of reindeer across an entire annual cycle remains something actively passed down and actively maintained, a living tradition rather than a purely historical one, continuing to shape how a meaningful portion of the population across this far northern landscape actually understands and moves through the same fjords, plateaus, and long seasonal cycles of light and dark that the rest of this journey has been exploring from a somewhat different angle. Traditional Sami culture also carries its own rich tradition of joik, a distinctive style of singing unlike almost anything found in the broader European musical tradition, built around melodies that are often understood, within Sami tradition as belonging to and representing a specific person, animal, or place, rather than simply being composed as a song about that subject in the way a more conventional song might be. A joik composed for a particular reindeer, or for a specific mountain, or for a person close to the singer, is traditionally understood not as a description sung from the outside, but as something closer to an evocation, an attempt to musically embody the very essence of whatever the joik represents, sung in a way that can feel, to someone unfamiliar with the tradition, both deeply personal and somehow ancient at the same time, carrying echoes of a landscape and a way of life that stretches back long before this same land was ever divided into the modern national borders now drawn across it. Picture one of these joiks sung quietly in the evening, perhaps around a small fire during a pause in the seasonal migration, the melody rising and falling in a pattern that doesn't follow the verse and chorus structure familiar to most other musical traditions, circling instead, repeating and shifting slightly with each pass, the way the reindeer's own migration circles the same general landscape, year after year without ever tracing exactly the same path twice. Someone listening who has spent their own life on this same land might recognize, within the shape of a particular joik, the specific mountain or valley or person it belongs to, a form of musical memory carried forward the same way the practical knowledge of snow and herd behavior has always been carried forward, through direct transmission from one generation to the next rather than through anything written down and set aside to be consulted later. We'll leave the Sami herders and their reindeer resting now, wherever across this vast, open landscape their particular seasonal cycle currently happens to place them, and we'll turn our attention for the final stretch of this journey through Norway's geography towards something that ties together nearly everything we've already explored tonight, a landscape that has never once, across the entire span of time we've been describing, actually finished forming, still shifting, still eroding, still rebuilding itself in ways too slow for any single lifetime to properly observe from beginning to end. Everything we have moved through tonight, the fjords cut by ancient ice, the mountains dividing wet coast from dry interior, the scattered fence of islands worn smooth by the same glaciers, the seasonal extremes of light and dark governed by the tilt of the earth itself, might seem, described this way, like a landscape that has already finished being made, a finished product simply waiting now to be visited, admired, and quietly lived within. But nothing about Norway's geography has ever actually stopped changing, and much of what makes this landscape feel so alive, so unusually dramatic, even by the standards of other mountainous or Arctic regions, comes directly from just how visibly and how continuously its various natural processes remain active even today. Consider the glaciers themselves, the same ice responsible for carving every fjord we discussed earlier in this journey. Though the great ice sheet that once covered the entire country retreated many thousands of years ago, Norway still holds a considerable number of smaller glaciers, found particularly across its higher mountain regions and in certain areas further north, ice that has persisted in a much reduced form ever since that original retreat, still moving, however slowly, still grinding against the rock beneath. It's still actively shaping the landscape it sits within in exactly the same basic way its far larger ancestor once shaped the entire country. Picture standing near the edge of one of these surviving glaciers on a quiet summer day, close enough to hear a particular sound that visitors often describe as genuinely startling the first time they encounter it. A low, groaning creak rising up from somewhere deep within the ice itself, followed sometimes by a sharper crack, the sound of the glacier's own enormous mass shifting and settling under its own weight, ice stressed past its ability to hold its current shape, finally giving way with an audible sound loud enough to carry clearly across the surrounding, otherwise silent landscape. This is a glacier actively, audibly working, right now, in real time, rather than simply sitting as a static, frozen monument to some ancient and finished process. Meltwater runs from beneath many of these glaciers constantly through the warmer months, a steady flow of intensely cold, often strikingly pale blue-white water, carrying with it a fine suspended powder called glacial flour, rock ground so finely by the ice above that it remains suspended in the water rather than settling out, the same substance responsible for the remarkable, almost impossibly vivid color found in certain glacier-fed lakes and rivers across this landscape. Water that looks, to someone unfamiliar with its origin, almost too brightly colored to be entirely natural. These same glaciers, along with the ordinary accumulation of mountain snow through the long winter, feed an entire network of waterfalls across Norway's steep, dramatic terrain, some of them among the tallest and most powerful found anywhere in Europe. Picture one of these falls in late spring, when the accumulated winter snowpack across the surrounding mountains begins its own seasonal melt, an enormous volume of water suddenly available all at once, funneling down through narrow mountain valleys and finally dropping, sometimes for hundreds of meters in a single unbroken fall, into a fjord or river far below, the sound of it audible from a considerable distance, a continuous, deep roar that becomes, for the communities living near enough to hear it regularly, simply another part of the seasonal soundscape marking spring's particular arrival each year. The volume and force of these waterfalls changes dramatically across the seasons in a way that makes them feel less like a fixed landscape feature and more like a living, breathing part of the annual cycle we've spent so much of this journey exploring. In the depth of winter, many of these same falls slow to a comparative trickle, some freezing partially or almost entirely solid, transforming from a roaring column of falling water into a still, silent wall of ice, holding within its frozen shape the exact form the water was falling in at the moment the cold finally caught up with it, a temporary sculpture that will hold its shape through the entire winter before eventually thawing and returning to its usual roaring flow once spring's meltwater arrives again to feed it. Some of these frozen falls become, in recent years, a destination in their own right for a small but dedicated group of ice climbers, drawn specifically by the challenge of ascending a wall of ice that, only a few months earlier, was simply moving water, and that will, only a few months later, return to that same liquid, roaring state, the climb itself possible only within this narrow seasonal window. When the fall has fully frozen but hasn't yet begun its spring thaw, a brief, specific opportunity that closes and reopens with the same reliable rhythm as everything else in this landscape's long annual cycle. This same seasonal snowmelt and the sheer steepness of so much of Norway's mountainous terrain also makes avalanches a genuine, ongoing feature of this landscape's continuing geological life. Snow accumulating across a steep slope through the winter months until, at some point, whether triggered by new snowfall adding weight too quickly, by a rise in temperature weakening the snowpack's internal structure, or simply by the accumulated instability finally reaching its natural limit, the entire mass gives way at once, sliding downhill with tremendous speed and force, carrying with it not just snow but often rock, soil, and any vegetation unfortunate enough to lie directly in its path. Communities living beneath particularly avalanche-prone slopes have developed their own detailed, practical understanding of this danger across generations of direct experience, much the way Sami herders developed their own detailed reading of snow conditions across the open tundra. Certain valleys are simply understood, through long local tradition, later confirmed by modern scientific mapping, to carry a higher risk during particular conditions. And Norwegian infrastructure in these more vulnerable areas often includes purpose-built structures specifically designed to either redirect an avalanche's path away from settled areas or to break its force before it can reach a road, a rail line, or a cluster of homes sitting in its potential path. Even the solid rock itself, The same ancient Precambrian bedrock we discussed earlier as forming the foundation of Norway's fjord walls continues its own far slower, far quieter process of ongoing change, weathered gradually by the same freeze and thaw cycles we explored right back at the very beginning of this entire series. Water finding its way into tiny cracks, freezing, expanding, and slowly widening those cracks further with each passing winter, occasionally culminating, particularly along the steepest and most exposed fjord walls, in a genuine rockfall. A section of cliff face finally breaking free after who knows how many centuries of this same slow, patient weakening, falling directly into the fjord waters below with enough force and enough displaced volume that, on rare and genuinely dramatic occasions throughout this country's history, the impact has generated a significant wave, capable of travelling a considerable distance along the enclosed waters of the fjord before finally losing its energy against the shore. Norwegian geologists monitor a number of these unstable rock faces continuously, using sensors embedded directly into the stone to detect the faint, gradual movement that typically precedes a major rockfall by months or even years. A slow widening of the same kind of crack we described earlier, measured now not by patient generations of local observation alone, but by precise instruments capable of detecting a shift of only a few millimeters, tracking a piece of mountain that may have already begun its final, slow-motion journey toward collapse long before any dramatic event would ever be visible to someone simply standing nearby and looking up at what still appears, to the eye, like nothing more than an ordinary, unmoving cliff face. There is something worth sitting with in these final moments of exploring Norway's landscape, in recognizing that everything we have described throughout this entire journey, the fjords, the mountains, the islands, the ice, remains, even now, an active and unfinished process rather than a completed one. The glacier groaning and cracking under its own weight tonight, the waterfall roaring at full spring volume, or standing frozen and silent in the depth of winter, depending entirely on which part of this endless cycle happens to be underway at this particular moment. The slow, patient widening of a crack in ancient bedrock, invisible in any single day but unmistakable across a long enough stretch of time, exactly the same principle we encountered so many times throughout our earlier journey beneath the surface of the earth entirely, and one that applies here, above ground, in these mountains and fjords, with exactly the same quiet, unhurried patience. Norway, in this sense, is not simply a place that ice once built and then finished with, leaving behind a fixed and settled landscape for people to move through and live within. It is a landscape still being built, still being reshaped, one imperceptible shift at a time, by forces that have never actually stopped working since the ice first began its retreat many thousands of years ago, and that show no particular sign of stopping now, continuing to fold and crack and grind their way through this stone exactly as they always have, indifferent to whether anyone's standing near bare. Tonight happens to be watching or not. We'll let that thought settle now, quietly, the way everything in this landscape eventually settles, and we'll begin, gently, to bring this particular journey to its own close. We began tonight in the dark, wondering how anyone could ever measure a coastline that keeps growing longer the closer you look at it. We end here now, having moved through nearly every layer of the answer, and finding that the answer was never really about measurement at all. It was about ice, patient beyond anything a ruler could account for, folding this coastline into a shape too intricate for any single number to hold. Everything we have followed tonight was built by the same few forces, returning again and again in different disguises. Ice, pressing down on stone for tens of thousands of years, carving valleys deep enough to become fjords once the sea finally arrived to fill them. The same ice, dragging itself across a scattered lowland near the coast, leaving behind 50,000 islands standing now as a quiet fence between the mainland and the open sea. Warm water, carried up from the tropics along a current no one can see, keeping harbours open at a latitude that should have frozen them solid, and keeping this whole strange country livable in a way its position on the globe never should have allowed. Light itself, behaving here unlike almost anywhere else on Earth, arriving in an unbroken flood through summer and withdrawing into months of near total dark through winter, all because of a tilt in the planet too small to properly picture and too large to escape. And beneath all of that light and dark, a sky occasionally catching fire in green and violet, charged particles from a star 93 million miles away spiraling down into air thin enough to glow when struck, an entirely silent performance that has been happening over this landscape since long before anyone stood beneath it with a name for what they were watching. Further north still, a territory where polar bears outnumber people, where permafrost holds a vault of seeds safe against almost anything that might happen anywhere else in the world, cold and stone doing. Together, the quiet work of protecting something that matters far beyond the small human settlement tucked into its margins. And across the open plateaus, a people whose understanding of this land reaches back further than any border ever drawn across it, following reindeer through 8 seasons instead of 4, reading snow the way the rest of us might read a familiar page, carrying songs that don't describe a mountain or an animal so much as become it for as long as the melody lasts. None of this has ever finished happening. That may be the last, quietest thing worth carrying with you from tonight. The glacier is still groaning under its own weight somewhere right now. The waterfall is either roaring at full spring force or standing frozen mid-fall, depending only on which part of the year happens to be turning at this exact moment. A crack in bedrock older than almost anything else on the surface of this planet is a fraction wider tonight than it was a year ago, and will be a fraction wider still a year from now, patient in exactly the way every landscape we have ever explored together has always been patient. Norway was never a finished place. It was always simply a process, still moving, wearing this particular shape for now, the way a wave wears its shape for the brief moment before it breaks and becomes something else entirely. Let that thought settle the way the water settles in the deepest part of a fjord, far below any wind, far below any weather, still and dark and undisturbed by whatever is happening on the surface far above it. The mountains still hold the weather, the islands still soften the sea, and the glaciers, wherever they remain, continue their slow, almost invisible work, shaping this landscape one patient moment at a time. And somewhere above all of it, whether in darkness or in light, depending on the season, the sky continues turning the way it always has, indifferent to whether anyone is watching, patient with a country that took the whole of the Ice Age simply to find its shape, and has spent every year since quietly, unhurriedly, becoming something a little different still. Good night. Sleep well.